Okay, thank you, Professor. Thank you so much for opening the series with such an absorbing and impassioned talk that I think has provoked quite a lot of fascinating dialogue in the chat from what I can see. We will get to that very soon, but I do want to dive straight into a few points that you've raised in the talk, if that's okay, and also take a few moments just to reflect on the production of the book itself. Okay, so one of the points you mentioned is the erasure of women in the Pan-African movement. Why exactly do you think that this has occurred, and how important do you think it is for this to be rectified?
Thanks very much. I mean, I think that even now, we don't have full equality. So you can imagine dealing with issues of a century ago and even further. And there were very prominent actors, you know, Harriet Tubman, for example, in the US, that were formidable figures, but obviously the erasure from history represented what the society was and what the society acknowledged at the time. And as I said, even today, we're still struggling with the same issues. So I think it's quite obvious that patriarchy and living in male-dominated societies that sets those priorities determines who gets heard and who gets recognized.
Okay, thank you. Also, another point you raised was industrialization and the wealth of the West and how this was built off of the back of slavery. What do you feel are the main hindrances that we have now in Africa when it comes to full industrialization?
The most important point is that many of our economies are still producing, are still basically getting minerals out of the ground and exporting it and not even adding value to it, you know? So if you get coffee or cocoa and you can't process it and export it, but it needs to be exported back to you in the form of chocolate or produced coffee, etc., then you have a problem. And the key issue is that only 14% of intra-regional trade in Africa is trade amongst ourselves. And so not only do we need to increase the trade amongst ourselves, we need to add value to that trade as well. And of course, there are obstacles in the global economy. You know, farming is where 70% of Africans find employment. But farming at the same time is where the US and the European Union in particular give grotesque subsidies to their farmers so that it's very hard for African farmers to be able to compete with them. And there is then dumping of goods also in African markets. So there are structural issues like that that I think are preventing Africa from doing that. But there has been some progress. We mustn't make it all bleak. In West Africa, for example, ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, has had some success with the free movement of peoples, and it's one of the most mobile regions of the world. I think something like 68% mobility. And the East African community has also been able to increase trade since it revived the East African community in the 2000s. So it's not all bleak, but we have some ways to go, both in Africa and the Caribbean, in terms of actually having that. And I mentioned that there are 16 landlocked countries in Africa as a result of the legacy of Berlin. That also makes it difficult to industrialize.
Absolutely. So would you say that you agree with the move that Ghana have made in terms of trying to take control over their cocoa industry quite recently?
Well, I mean, talk is cheap, and a lot of leaders in Africa, in the Caribbean, in the Americas talk a lot. But what we need to see is actually the results of that talk. So, I mean, Ghana has been independent for 60 years, or 63 years, actually, longer than most of us. There's no reason why it should now be trying to take control of its cocoa. We have to see how this actually works in practice.
Okay, yeah, definitely. One of the many things that I enjoyed about the book was the very strong use of metaphor, and you made a lot of really interesting comparisons, one of which was between European slavery and the Black Death of 1346. Could you just expand on that a little bit? Because I found that quite an interesting comparison.
Yes, the point I was making is that during the Black Death in the 14th century, 50 million out of 80 million Europeans perished in an 8-year period. And that was considered a total catastrophe. But if you think about slavery, slavery went on for 4.5 centuries, you know, and something like 20 million people are thought to have perished as a result of it. So it's just trying to basically, in a very graphic way, show how horrendous and horrific slavery was and the structural damage that it's left behind even today.
Yeah. And then still on the issue of slavery, what would you say to those people who hold the view that slavery was simply a matter of Africans selling other Africans, almost quite a self-inflicted woe, if you will?
It's definitely true that African monarchs were involved in slavery. Asante, Oyo, Benin, other kingdoms were definitely involved. But I would say that the big beneficiaries of slavery were basically the European slavers and missionaries and merchants. What they were given to these African monarchs was basically things like gunpowder, trinkets, cheap gin. It wasn't, they were cogs in the wheel, basically. And the other, we should condemn that, though. I'm not saying that we should just excuse what African monarchs did during the slave trade, but we need to look at it within the broader context, that there were very small cogs in the wheel. And the other thing that's important to note is that they were often coerced, and some of them either intimidated or killed if they did not take part in this slave trade. So it wasn't just a simple issue of all of them willingly benefited from it. There was a lot of pressure for them to be part of this system as well. But we should condemn it. I don't think it's something that one can just condone or wish away.
Okay. And similarly, you know, you speak on the catastrophic results of the Berlin Conference. Would you say that you agree that Africa was quite helpless to prevent the events that unfolded? So I know that you mentioned that in the book as well, that some have said that. Would you agree?
You know, it's quite incredible that in 1880, about 80% of African territory was controlled by Africans. And within 30 years, the European powers had basically parceled out the entire continent amongst themselves, or most of it anyway, a few exceptions like Ethiopia and Liberia. I think due to the technological advantage, and people have often referred to the Maxim gun, but it would have been very difficult for African countries who were quite divided and dissipated to have been able to put up resistance. You do have some cases of African resistance, you know, but I think it would have been very difficult to actually resist it. I mean, if the imperialists were able to rule over a country as massive and a civilization as old as India with just a few thousand British colonial administrators, I think that we had really not a lot of chance.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's something that is spoken of a lot. So I just wanted to get your views on that. Another great thing about the chapter is the way that you include the strengths and also the shortcomings of many Pan-African thinkers and leaders. Are there any that you would say you're most aligned with their approach? Like you outlined the difference between Nkrumah and Nyerere. Would you say that there are any that you agree with more or you think are a stronger approach?
I mean, I think one can take good things out of the approach of many people, you know, but it's very hard because the circumstances under which they were operated, the international circumstances, and the fact that there was a Cold War going on in which the Soviet Union and the United States were basically competing with each other to try to, get allies or clients, I think would be more appropriate for themselves. And the fact that France was operating a neo-colonial system in which it created military bases, tied the currencies of these countries to its own currencies, kept reserves in France. We mustn't ignore those circumstances as well. But I think that in the end, Nkrumah was too much of an idealist. Nkrumah was wanting to run before he could walk. So his ideas were good ideas, but the idea of a common currency, of a African government, of an African military high command, it's not even happened now 6 decades later. So I think Julius Nyerere was probably more accurate in his assessment that you need to build sub-regional pillars that are strong in each of Africa's sub-regions before you can actually promote more genuine regional integration. But yeah, there are lots of figures like that that I admire, and we think we have to take the best out of each of their ideas, But somebody like George Padmore, I think, deserves to have a lot more credit for the intellectual depth and the organization skills with which he approached the fight for Pan-Africanism. And that was one of my favorite chapters in the book, because I think is a figure that doesn't get necessarily the kind of acclaim that he deserves, in terms of the kind of fights that he fought. And Ruth Firth, for example, a white South African woman, often considered more a Marxist than a Pan-Africanist, is somebody that we thought was interesting to include in the volume because she ended up being martyred. She died from an apartheid letter bomb in Mozambique, but she fought a lot of struggles in terms of trying to help the Mozambican government to develop and to formulate kind of revolutionary economic policies, and also worked on countries like Namibia, on Libya. She was a real Pan-Africanist in terms of her engagements as well. So we try to bring out less known figures and figures that would not be necessarily considered in conventional terms to have been Pan-Africanists.
Yeah, but was definitely very successful in doing that. Over the years, what would you say are some of the greatest successes of Pan-Africanism, and what would you, opposing that, say is still one of the main challenges that we face?
I mean, the greatest achievement is undoubtedly the liberation of Africa and the Caribbean from colonial rule. That is what Pan-Africanism was fighting for, and that's what eventually happened. I think in the post-independence era, the support from both the US and the Caribbean, Pan-Africanists in both places, and the Americas to some extent as well, for the anti-apartheid struggle, I would say is also an important milestone to make. In terms of challenges at the moment, the problem is that when Pan-Africanism returned home after Manchester and became institutionalized in the form of the Organization of African Unity in 1963, it basically lost its civil society kind of passion and commitment. And so it became less kind of radical, it became less grassroots, and a lot of the links to American and Caribbean groups has been lost. And so that's why I'm calling for a reinvigoration of Pan-Africanism. And we need to find new issues. The Black Lives Matter, which is why I kept referring to it, is an opportunity to find that, because the using of blacks as target practice by the police in the US, mostly white police, and killing innocent blacks in many cases, is something that should be a matter of importance for both Africans and the Caribbean. So, and there's widespread racism in continuing in many of these places. You know, we saw the protests in places like Paris, in Brussels, in London. And so there are many issues that need to be tackled. And what has happened recently is that Britain has been forced to confront its imperial history, which it had always romanticized and kind of glorified. And I think that's what the Center for Pan-African Thought in London is trying to push, and many other scholars like Olusoga and Kehinde Andrews and others. And I think those are battles that we have to also identify with and support as well.
Okay, I mean, touching on Black Lives Matter, I'm glad you brought them up. I was going to ask, how would you say the Black Lives Matter movement fits in with the objectives of Pan-Africanism today?
I mean, Black Lives Matter is effectively saying that the human rights of Black citizens, wherever they are, not just in America. That's why those protests in Europe were also so important in terms of Black Lives Matter, is a case for everybody. It's recognizing a common humanity. And that is the importance of Black Lives Matter. The fact that it went from America to start challenging established ideas in Europe and started forcing Belgium, for example, to start looking at the legacy of King Leopold, not as one that is glorified in terms of his rule in the Congo, but one that assaults Congolese and African people living in those places. And I think that's the importance of Black Lives Matter. Okay,
thank you. Moving to education, do you think that we will ever see a full decolonization of curriculums in the West and other parts of the world, as there's been a lot of talk about decolonizing the curriculum? Do you see this as something that is possible, especially bearing in mind who's going to be delivering this curriculum?
I don't think so, because I think one should not be naive about assuming that everybody wants to decolonize the curriculum, because there are people that are quite happy to have the curriculum as it is. Yeah. And unless you keep pushing for it, for the inclusivity, I mean, we're pushing on an open door at the moment, because there's a certain moment in history where people are being forced to rethink established ideas that they had. So I think there will be reforms that will happen, but there can also be a backlash, as we're seeing in the US, you know, with all sorts of state governments threatening to withdraw money from educational departments or schools that actually teach certain forms of history that try to be inclusive. So it's a battle that is going to have to continue to be fought over and over again, but we will have a more transformed curriculum, I think, going forward in the future. But these are things that are, I think, perpetual struggles that will have to continue.
Okay, I'm just going to squeeze in one more question before I open up to everyone else. What would you say then, just to finish, is the significance and benefit of Pan-Africanism today?
I mean, I think, as I said, I think that Pan-Africanism is kind of like a lost cause, if you like, because it's kind of like been institutionalized too much in intergovernmentalism. So, you know, you see the African Union trying to do their thing. You see summits between African governments and Caribbean governments, intergovernmentalism. But what we actually need to push for is a Pan-Africanism of the people and ideas and things like that. So we need to make sure that organizations or movements like Black Lives Matter are linked to similar movements in the Caribbean and Africa and the Americas that have similar goals as well. And that's going to be a long struggle. You know, in the age of internet and social media, there's less commitment than we saw from people like C.L.R. James and Padmore and Senghor and Césaire. Those guys really sacrificed and were prepared to, really go a long way. That kind of commitment is often not there in this day and age. So there's a lot of work to do. We can't exclude the governments, of course, but they mustn't necessarily lead the processes. They must support them.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much, Professor. Thank you for your insights, your analysis. We are huge admirers, as you know, of your work and the book. And I just think we're very lucky to have people like yourself producing the literature that we need to study and contextualize Pan-Africanism in the correct way. So we really do appreciate your commitment to that cause.